with that, welcome again. Really exciting to see everybody read names and have you join us for this Dialogues with Dexis event titled Informing Peacebuilding in Coastal West Africa, Lessons Learned from the Sahel. My name is Nicole Goodrich. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a senior technical advisor with Dexis's Center for Global Security and Stabilization. Before I turn to my colleague, Jen Hollinger, who's also a senior technical advisor and will be moderating this panel today, she's going to also introduce the four guests, but I want to give a few reminders for our time together. And also please allow me to briefly share information about the Center for Global Security and Stabilization, often referred to as the Center or CGSS. The center was established in 2018 and works to strategically position Dexis as a leader in global security and stabilization by leveraging existing capabilities, gaining new insights, and securing new programming with U.S. government clients. In collaboration with other Dexis divisions, the center team identifies priority technical and regional focus areas for peacebuilding, security, and stabilization, reaches out to client and partner contacts, designs pilot programs, and plans events such as this. Dialogues with Dexis will continue to bring together diverse practitioners in global security, conflict and violence prevention, peace building, and stabilization to discuss emerging trends and new innovations. I asked the website upcoming dialogue in 2023. Lastly, please panelists' views and experiences are theirs alone and do not necessarily reflect or represent those of Dexis. With that, thank you all again for joining us this morning and this evening, wherever you're dialing in from. And now let's get ready to listen and learn more about regional, national, and community level peace building efforts in the Sahel and coastal West Africa. Over to you, Jen.
Thank you very much, Nicole. As Nicole mentioned, we're really excited to have you all here with us today at the Informing Peacebuilding in Coastal West Africa, Lessons Learned from the Sahel Dialogue with Dexis. Today, we're going to be taking a reflective view of key lessons learned from regional, national, and community peacebuilding efforts in the Sahel, and how we can practically apply those to programming in coastal West African states, understanding that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. The coastal West African states have been identified as a priority region for sustainable conflict prevention assistance under the U.S. Global Fragility Act of 2019, and also dovetails nicely with the more recent U.S. strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability from this year. Some of the key lessons learned we're going to be talking about and discussing today include the importance of engaging, supporting, and enabling local communities to maximize impact, as well as the inclusion of social groups, especially traditionally marginalized groups, in peace building so that they don't become spoilers or susceptible themselves to violence. Another key lesson learned is the importance of building a democratic culture and not just democratic mechanisms, as well as discussing building trust with communities and how critical that is to understanding their needs, as well as getting accurate data on fragility, conflict, and violence. So in terms of how today's event will work, as my colleague Nicole mentioned, we'll have four panelists who will be speaking. And after those four panelists, we'll have a moderated Q&A discussion. You should see at the bottom of your Zoom window, there is a Q&A function. Please feel free to type your questions in there at any time. We ask that you please don't use the chat. And during the Q&A, if you'd like to raise your hand, you can do that as well, and we will get to your questions. So with that, I'm going to turn to our first panelist, who is Rita Liamori, the Independent Senior Sahel Advisor and Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. His research focuses on geopolitical and international relations in the West African Sahel, a region where he's worked for about a decade. He has extensive experience supporting both governmental and non-governmental organizations in international aid, development, and security. The topics he covers include countering violent extremism, conflict prevention and conflict sensitivity, humanitarian access, and migration. Mr. Liamori holds a master's degree in public policy with an emphasis on national security from the School of Policy, Government, and International Affairs at George Mason University. And today, Mr. Liamori has pre-recorded his remarks, and he'll be discussing the shortcomings of the focus of programming in the Sahel on counterterrorism, over supporting local communities, and how this has caused some harm through stigmatization and made it difficult to work on local capacity building. So with that, let's go to Mr. Liamori's remarks.
Thank you for having me this morning, and thanks for this timely discussion. As you have highlighted, I think the Sahel and West Africa is going through critical times, and when we look at the past 10 years, and that's the time that I have spent working on the region, it is a desperate need for debates, a dialogue, and discussions about looking into what has worked and has not worked. And it's unfortunate, when we look at the situation today, it's safe to say that not necessarily international and national actors have failed in terms of bringing stability to the region, but we can say that there are many shortcomings, and there is a desperate need for innovative and new strategy to tackle issues that have caused the ongoing instability in the region. And I think clearly we can see that based on the data that we have. For example, every year since 2020, I think that the amount of violence, number of casualties have reached all-time high. Intercommunity tensions are all-time high. The multiple coups d'etats that occurred in the past couple of years as well. So there are a lot of indicators that have, that pushes us to rethink how we try to examine and address ongoing issues. So let's go back. Let's go a little bit. Go back to when things started. It's difficult to say when exactly things started, but just when I started working on the region in 2011 to this day, I think the international and national actors spent a lot of time focusing on especially the international community, focused on what is more of interest to them rather than what is more of interest to local communities and what is more of interest to national partners. For example, the focus was on violent extremism, on migration, for example, are just issues why they are important to address, but at the same time, these were not the key drivers to instability in the region. These were contributed to instability, contributed to existing issues that have not been addressed for decades. So based on my experience, and I know when talking to local communities, these local communities have survived the harshest conditions you could think of for many decades, and violence has yet to exist, or even if it existed, it was very limited. Tensions between communities existed, but they were resolved peacefully, and they were mechanisms that has worked. But then after 2011, when the international community, in collaboration with national partners, they came in and they looked at those communities that have been neglected for decades. They looked at them as if they are the problem. So initially, they were not offered access to basic services. And then when the international community and national actors demonstrated interest, it was more of kind of looking at them, and they said, you are now interested in us, and you are looking at us just like we are the problem. But you did not look at other issues that have existed, like corruption, the coup d'etats, the atrocities by the state, etc., that have intensified those grievances. So that's one of the issues that I have observed for the past decade, is this stigmatization of certain communities and against and others. The focus was, as I mentioned, on violence extremism, for example, the focus was on the outsiders, on the problems, on an actor that was unknown to many of us, international and national actors, that it was very difficult to understand how they operate, how they are, the energy, to rephrase what I was saying, the energy and the resources were spent on trying to understand how these actors like violence extremists, how they operate, how they get in financed, how they recruit, etc. And we kind of like know some of this answers to these questions, but we didn't invest enough to understand the local communities rather than the external, like understand like the cohesion, what strengthens the social cohesion between these communities, how could these communities continue to coexist, and then how to overcome the new challenges. So those communities looked at the international and national actors as, you are interested on the bad guys, and instead of trying to invest in us and try to understand what could be done to improve our lives, and that creates some pushbacks from local communities. Another issue that I think practitioners also have faced in the region, I would say the capacity of local actors, local partners. There is a strong lack of resources, lack of human resources in the region. We see a lot of times, we see that, for example, that the donors release call for proposals, etc., and they put some of the requirements to engage with local partners, to involve local partners, but which is good. But at the same time, it shouldn't be just a checkbox. It should be have thought thoroughly, like work with first of all, assess the capacity of local partners and try to work with them to improve the capacity, rather than just, we are working with local partners, and a lot of times those local partners have little knowledge to no knowledge to what's really happening in conflict areas. So they do satisfy in the contract side, but they don't satisfy the side of like understanding the issues that are causing the conflicts, and so they could contribute to bringing some stability to the region. So that's one of the examples I have witnessed. In addition to the local partners, started to understand this political economy of working with the international community, and became sort of a business. So they know how to sell themselves. They know how to present themselves. They have the capabilities, they have the access, etc. But when it comes to implementation and to actions, they have shown also a lot of limitations. And that was the responsibility of the donors to realize that soon enough, and to prevent that from continuing to happen. And I can guarantee you also that this continues to happen to this day. So I think investing in the capacity building has also, it's one of the problems, but also one of the solutions going forward. Another example, another lesson is I have witnessed a lack of synergy between security efforts and development efforts. The region was witnessing and continues to witness a major counterterrorism efforts. Simultaneously, there are a lot of ongoing development efforts, developments and stabilization efforts happening, but there is not a good synergy and communication between all the actors involved. And that's why we have seen some success in counterterrorism efforts. For example, chasing extremist groups from areas, liberating some towns, villages, as we have seen in Mali. But does that mean necessarily stability and then the problem has been resolved? No. These groups continue to relocate and continue to impose a threat to those local communities, and they continue to exist. They don't control and govern spaces. although they do in some areas, but they don't control big cities, they don't control big towns, but they remain present and they remain a threat and they continue to expand. So what I was saying is in coordination between security operations and development stabilization, needs to be some coordination. So when villages, towns are been liberated, there should be a space. There should be the ability to create a space for the state to return and create an environment where jihadist groups or extremists cannot return. Unfortunately, that has not been the case in a lot of areas of in the Sahel. Some very quickly, some of the recommendations briefly. I think we should definitely invest in getting the real picture at the micro level. When we look at the region, we can't put all of it in one basket. It's a different issue from one village to another, from one town to another. The issues are different from one area to another. So I think looking into the issues at the micro level is key going forward. And as have you mentioned earlier, I think we need to look at what could be some of the actionable and immediate impact programming that could be happening to have that immediate impact, and simultaneously work on the long-term goals and long-term strategy to, as I mentioned earlier, to prevent the conflicts to return and the same existing issues to return to the area. Also, I think there is a strong need to be able to identify and map the key actors who to work with and who not to work with. For example, if we speak about programming specifically, how much results do we get if we work with, for example, authorities who have been displaced and now they are based in the capital? They have no visibility what's happening in their areas that they're supposed to be governing. They have no idea what's going on. So how valuable is that, and how much results are we going to achieve if we work with those authorities who are not present in the areas they're supposed to govern? So I think we have to rethink of how to do that, how to create an environment for these authorities to return to their areas. Also, I think there is a strong need of improving the civil-military coordination and engagements in order to create some positive synergy and create an environment for stability and for displaced population to return to their home communities. I think I will stop here, but I would be very interested to hear your remarks and then your questions as well. Thank you.
Okay, we will thank Rita for his remarks. I think one of the key points, he raised a lot of key points, but one of the things that we will definitely see throughout the speaker's remarks, and I'm sure probably will echo in the question and answer session, is really the focus on understanding local communities at the micro level and how can we sort of parlay that into actionable programming. So we'll move now to our next speaker, Petitin Oke, who is a Fulbright Research Fellow in Benin. She is a global development professional and social scientist with experience in advanced research and programming focused on democratic governance, gender and women's empowerment, sustainable development, security, and public policy. Currently, Petitin is a Fulbright Research Fellow in Benin. She's also the founder and CEO of African Public Policy Consulting, which provides high-quality consulting services in monitoring and evaluation, research and learning in conflict and crisis, democracy and governance, agricultural and food security, economic development, education, and global health sectors. Petitin holds a PhD in African Studies and Public Policy and Development from Howard University and a master's degree in human rights from the University of Aubervilliers. Today, she's going to discuss the importance of including women and youth in peace building and what this engagement looks like at the local community level. She's going to share some ways that we can build trust in local communities that she's applied in her own field research, and stressed the importance of listening to local voices and understanding what issues are important and resonate with the community. Over to you, Penitent.
Thank you for having me and allowing me to share a few lessons I learned on ground. So I will be talking about the importance of including women in peace building and what it looks like in the community, local level. So it is no doubt that nowadays women have a crucial play in the resolution of conflict and peace building. Several studies have already demonstrated that in situations where women have participated to peace process are many. Kofi Annan once said, there is no development strategy more beneficial to society as a whole, women and men alike, than the one which involves women as central players. So if considering that women are indeed more than half population, why shouldn't they participate in partnership with men in all the process of peace building, conflict resolution, and prevention of violent extremism? It is important to understand that women are more than victims of gender-based violence. So literature has shown that since December 2021, Benin has experienced an increase in attack attributed to Islamic group in its border areas. So to this end, the government of the Republic of Benin in a recent report shows the donation of material, military mostly, by development partners through support program for the prevention of conflict and violence extremism in the borders area of Benin. However, the multiplicity of action in the prevention of fight against violent extremism in Benin raises the question about the participation of women. So indeed, the participation of women in Benin, whatever sector or field, is confronted with constraints, which reduces its field of action. So violent extremism adds to the existing problem of governance and inequality in northern Benin and victimizes women of all ages by inflicting all kinds of violence on them, as well as, kidnapping, sexual abuse, etc. So this further reduces their freedom and their fundamental right. So I'm gonna share with you some lessons I learned during my field research in Benin. So first, we want to find out the understanding of the population of violent extremism, how they comprehend the concept, and what is the terminology that they use. From my experience, I think there is a kind of confusion between gender-based violence and violent extremism. They are more used to what is called jihadist attack or the Boko Haram attack to express the understanding of violent extremism. At some places, because there is a kind of psychosis hovering among the population after recent attack, we were advised by the law enforcement not to directly start any interview or any discussion with the population with the word jihadist, because it is difficult to know who is or is not affiliated to any to a violent extremist organization. And I will advise to always get in touch with the local administration, law enforcement, and chief of villages prior any those people may have relevant advice to give, and they are known by the community. So since there is no institutional mechanism in place involving women in the prevention of violent extremism, I believe that the women association or civil society organization, NGO, working with women in diverse domains, including education, transformation of agricultural products, and etc., could be equipped with necessary resources to involve women in PVE. So during my fieldwork, what I noticed was that most of the women belongs to an association where they gather to discuss what they have, what issue they have in the household, and maybe economic issue, even the education of the children. So this could be a big platform that can be used at community level to educate women about violent extremism, what it is about, and how to prevent it and keep the locality safe. It is also important to build and use the local expertise. Build just limited to trying to respect or imitate their way of dressing, understand few words and languages. It is more working deeply with local guide partners who already established strong connection with population, especially women, and who understand the culture and the tradition. So what we cannot do is to go on ground with stereotype and assume that a methodology or that were used in other parts of Africa can be used everywhere in the continent. Each country is unique and has its unique things. The northern part of Benin being 90% Muslim, women are not allowed or encouraged to speak openly before men. So being a woman itself denies a woman a chance to participate in decision-making position. Despite this limited space for women participation, when given an opportunity, women can share transformative ideas in the field of prevention violent extremism. And I think they can individually start in their own household by raising awareness if they have the resources to do so. So to wrap up, women in North Benin are willing to do more to keep their community safe. And they said it during my fieldwork that they want to be like men. They want to do things that the men do they want to their voice to be heard in any decision making about crisis and conflict that occurs in the community. But in the same time, they cannot ignore the culture and tradition and religion. So not that all are bad, but it is a question of working with that and working with what is already in place and find a kind of equilibrium. Thank you for your attention, and I will be glad to respond to any question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedicin. I think, again, Pedicin brings up some very important themes, including the importance of contextualization and localization as we try to unpack some of these very difficult conflict issues. Our next speaker is Alan Bobbitt, who is currently the Chief of Party on the Equal Access Resilience for Peace project. He has over 25 years of experience in nonprofit development, stabilization, and peacebuilding work, and has spent over 20 years working, living, and studying in the Sahel region, and brings a unique blend of local and historical knowledge to bear on the problem sets facing the Sahel. He's worked in Libya, Tunisia, Uganda, Mali, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Cote d'Ivoire. He holds graduate degrees in psychology and international relations and served as a therapist for 13 years before working in international development. And today, Alan's going to be speaking to us a little bit about how programs focused on creating a democratic culture as opposed to democratic mechanisms is a really important lesson learned from the Sahel region for work in the coastal West African states. Over to you, Alan.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're logging in from. I just saw my weather app popped up the temperature, and it says that the reporting station is from Place de la Paix, so the place of peace. So I'm obviously in the perfect venue to talk about peace building. And I really want to chat about today in a brief time, just about the differences between democratic mechanisms, such as elections, and the building of democratic cultures as a programming priority. Having lived and worked in the Sahel so many years, I've witnessed multiple elections, and oftentimes after elections, I'm reminded of Joseph Stalin's quote all the way back from 1923, where he said, "I consider it completely unimportant who will vote and how, but what is extraordinarily important is who will count the votes and how." So the more things change, sometimes the more they remain the same. The idea of free and fair elections is obviously a pillar of democracy, of democratic building, democracy building. And yet, in spite of the massive resources that have been poured into the region on ensuring free and fair elections, we've seen democratic backsliding across the region in the appearance of multiple coups d'etats, especially of late. Almost all the youth that I talk to in the region still believe in democracy, but the fact is that overcoming decades of autocratic, dictatorial, corrupt rule takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. And the problems with election is no matter how dedicated election observers can be, they can't access all the areas. And so in a recent election, I saw a region that I knew to be over 90% nomadic, turning in a voter turnout of 90%. So I wonder just how they got out to all those nomadic encampments and got everybody to come in and vote on the correct day. Obviously, we have some lessons to learn. In October, we witnessed yet another coup in Burkina Faso, which is the 7th across the region, I believe, in just a little bit over 2 years. Alan Altin speaks about the myth of the enlightened military man who can solve problems. And Burkina Faso, case in point, for 50 of its 62 years has been ruled by military officers who seized power. So it's tough. Soldiers often lack the same capacity to address non-security issues that the civilians that they replace may have. So I don't think that, I don't have a whole lot of hope for democratic building by military governments. When we look across the region, military interventions, even though they've had a wide coalition of partners, they've had a wide range of both regional partners, international partners, they have not stopped the spread of violent extremism. And as a result, we have this destabilized landmass, these continuous swath of countries, band of countries that represent a landmass 9 times the size of Afghanistan, with a population of 138 million people, which is 3 times that of Iraq, that's unstable. It's got to represent one of the greatest crises, security crises, that we see in the world today. And it's not because the people of the Sahel have some predilection towards violence. They don't. They've lived peacefully and coexisted for centuries, for the most part. The reason is pretty obvious. If you've lived and worked in the Sahel for a while, the reason is toxic governance. Toxic governance is when you have generations of corrupt leadership They've denied people democracy. They've denied them basic human rights. They've denied them human development. They denied them investment, both foreign and local. And I would say that toxic governance, and I don't think this is that controversial, toxic governance is the breeding ground for violent extremism. In fact, in the coup in Burkina Faso recently, Al-Qaeda went on social media to mock the coup, to say the tyrants should know that multiple coups are not going to avail them. And it's very difficult when the extremist narrative says, where is your democracy? Where is your state? Where is your government? Where is your constitution? What has the government done for you lately? And those statements are pretty much true. How do you counter a narrative that is really based on the fact that, especially in border regions, there has been a lack of governance for decades? One of my favorite definitions of democracy is very simple. It's by Larry Diamond, who says that democracy is a means by which people choose their leaders and then hold them accountable for their policies and conduct while they're in office. So the mechanism is the election, and then the culture that we want to develop in countries is that of accountability. So that accountability takes active participations of citizens in both public and civic life, political life. It takes their active involvement, and it takes the other thing, which is the equitable application of the rule of law. It's very, very difficult for democracy to flourish when there's not free law, fair law as well, engaged in the process. The lack of accountable governance, as I've said, is denied basic goods and services to their citizens. They've contributed to chronic poverty, weak capacity. We watch public leaders take state assets as though they're personal entitlement. They create policies that benefit the minorities. We see endemic corruption because senior leaders politically and legally protect underlings, so that corruption becomes endemic throughout the entire system down to the local levels. And then we see as well the politicization of the judiciary. And again, when the judiciary is not free and independent, then government officials can act with impunity because they're not going to be convicted for, even when they're exposed, oftentimes they're not convicted or held to account for what they've taken. When you grow up in a system like that consists of corruption, inequity, illegitimacy, cronyism, whatever acronym you want to throw out there, it becomes readily apparent that the only way to get ahead is to seize your turn at the top. And so that just necessarily leads to more and more violent political transition and destabilization. The only way to get ahead is to be on the top, right? Then the other thing that I'm seeing often throughout the Sahelian countries is this self-serving narrative, and Rita referred to this as well, this external narrative that all the problems are being driven by external actors. And of course, throughout the Sahel, France is the current favorite scapegoat, correct? But the issue with that, whether it's a focus on France or a focus on violent extremism coming in from other countries, is that as long as the problem is external, governments still lack accountability to correct the problems that they can correct. And that requires this accountable governance, this democratic culture that I'm talking about. Having said that, colonialist legacies are very real, very painful. And in many cases, they created the system of elites that continue to hold power in many of these countries. So I don't want to dismiss that whatsoever. However, it's not the only narrative. And I think that hopefully the littoral states can resist going that direction, because it takes them off the hook for fixing the things that they can fix when it comes to governance. A country's resources cannot continue to be exploited without internal complicity. And we want to get governments looking at that internal complicity, because accountable governments will hold foreign powers accountable as well. And accountable governments will be replaced if they're not accountable for safeguarding the resources and assets of their country. So how do we do that? How do we develop a democratic culture? It's not easy, but I'm fond of saying just because things aren't easy doesn't mean we shouldn't be engaged in doing them. It's a very complex context. Obviously, there's an interdependence of issues and actors across the Sahel. We can name security, we can name environmental, climate change, we can name health, education. There are so many interplaying factors. So it is a complex system. But I think we begin with education and a new cadre of leaders that are developed. We need to support public and private institutions. And I think aid, in my personal opinion, needs to be linked to governmental behavioral change. There has to be this provision of goods and service to an accountable relationship with the population. I think we have to support African institutions such as ECOWAS and the African Union so that they can be the flag bearers for accountable governance and not just focus on unconstitutional power changes. And of course, those organizations are going to have to lead the way by example and demonstrate accountable governance in their own structures as well. To quote an Americanism, democracy is always by and for the people, but it's a messy process. I think the process of building that culture begins with local and national dialogues, and those dialogues have to be incredibly inclusive. They have to include marginalized groups, women, youth, opposition voices. Whereas we see in unaccountable governance, they repress and even use state assets to repress opposition voices, to repress a free and fair press, which is also a pillar of democracy. So we see the opposite of that. But these local dialogues, these national dialogues have to be fully inclusive. We have to bring the dissenters to the table. One of my favorite things that my grandfather told me was that if you want to understand the difference between union and unity, then tie two roosters, tie two male chickens together, and you'll immediately understand the difference between union and unity. That's kind of what democracy is like. It's a little bit messy, but that political process has to be allowed to play out with everybody having a voice. And those dissenters, there's always dissenters in every democracy, even when you're trying to build one. Those dissenters, you have to maintain communication with those dissenters to always let them know there's a place at the table for them. Because if there is one clear lesson that's been learned in the Sahel, it's that exclusion drives radicalization. So I think from those dialogues, we have to have locally elected leaders, and often in conflict affected countries, those won't be politicians. Perhaps they'll be traditional leaders, religious leaders, civic leaders, and that's not a bad thing to get a new group of people in. So again, very, very short conversation about a very, very complex topic. I look forward to your questions, and I would like to see programming in the future that really focuses less on the mechanisms and more on the development of a culture of transparency, honesty, and accountability to the citizenry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan, and for raising a couple of very interesting points that I think also we'll continue to see with our final speaker, and probably in our question and answer session related to democratic culture and norms and the inclusion of diverse views, to improve the effectiveness of our programming. So with that, I'm going to introduce our final speaker, who is Laura Sanders, the owner of CEDIS Global. She specializes in conflict analysis, peace building, and crisis response. And for over 20 years, she has advised international organizations, development agencies, and local peace builders on strategies to prevent and mitigate violence. She engages peace builders at the highest and lowest socio-political levels to design impactful programming at the intersection of climate, economics, gender, and governance. Laura holds a master's degree from the Georgetown School of Foreign Service and is now based in Benin and is the director of CEDIS Global. And she's currently writing a book about the Fulani. So today, Laura is going to speak to us a little bit about social and political inclusion and the importance of integrating the Fulani people into peace building programming. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Laura.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak today. Alan did a wonderful job setting me up. So I'm going to start exactly where Alan left off. He said that exclusion drives radicalization. And I think that is a really good encapsulation of what we've seen in the Sahel and elsewhere in the world, that when we have groups that do not feel like they're part of the national government or part of local communities, that makes them incredibly vulnerable to manipulation by outside actors. So I'm going to talk today about one particular group that is very vulnerable because of exclusion, and that, as we've seen in the Sahel, can play a pivotal role for better or worse in conflict and stabilization. So I'm going to talk today about the Fulani ethnic group. They have a lot of different names in West Africa. They are variously called the Fulani, the Fulbe, and lots of other names. I'm going to try to be consistent today and say Fulani, but it's a lot of different names, different languages for the same group of people. So just by way of a very quick background, the Fulani are a West African ethnic group that is traditionally pastoralist, meaning that their primary livelihood strategy is rearing livestock with seasonal movement of herds in a sort of loose annual cycle to access pasture and water in an environment where water in particular is both scarce and unpredictable. In West Africa, they're estimated to be between 25 and 50 million people. So it's a significant group. In Mali, for example, that's about 13% of the population. They play an enormous economic and food security role in all of the West African countries, although that role is sometimes invisible. Historically, the Fulani were able to survive climate shocks and other shocks through migration into into areas where the weather was more suitable to keep their herds alive. And then they engaged in trade with ethnic groups that had other livelihood strategies. So with the farmers and the fishers, and that trade played a critical role for economics and especially food security throughout the region. So in years when the fish weren't biting or years when the crops failed, multiple ethnicities had access to the milk and cheese usually from the herd. So that's sort of an essential source of resilience, especially as we think about climate change and the increasing marginalization of the rangelands. These sort of win-win trade arrangements, unfortunately, have been breaking down. And what we see now is, I think, layers of risk to these relationships. The one that we hear about the most is increased population and increased pressure on scarce resources. I actually feel that that risk is overstated often because I think there's a tendency when we talk about ethnic conflict in Africa to believe that it is sort of an inherent ahistoric problem. You know, the farmers and the herders, they're always fighting because there's not enough water. And I think that to some extent frees governance of responsibility. I think that what we see is, in fact, that there is increased pressure on natural resources. But we also see that pressure is in part caused by governance failures. It's caused by poor management of those resources. And that where we have that competition is not necessarily conflict. It becomes conflict when you don't have local systems for managing competition, for stewarding resources, and when you don't have trust in the judicial system, so that a cow straying into a farm becomes a massive problem with reprisal killings. It becomes sort of an ethnic conflict because people feel that they have no other recourse, because they feel that the state services are not protecting them, that their land tenure is not secure, and that then unfortunately has been very much manipulated by elites in different West African countries. We see in Mali and Niger very clear examples of elites using those existing tensions to drive their own self-interest. The feeling is that the Fulani don't vote. And therefore, when there are divisions, it's often in those elites' interest to scapegoat and to make symbolic actions against the Fulani as a way of appealing to sort of the fear and the anger that's driving communities, and to focus that in the same way that Alan talked about focusing on maybe it was Rita, on extremists as sort of the blame, the scapegoat. I think that the Fulani often suffer that same fate. In the Sahel, what we saw was that the manipulation of ethnic divisions, the sense of sort of desperation on the part of the Fulani as they were caught with no one to trust, is that they became very vulnerable to both manipulation and recruitment by extremist groups, but also violence on the part of the state. Unfortunately, we are now seeing more and more evidence of the human rights abuses perpetrated against the Fulani, in particular in Mali, and massacres. And that news is reaching, of course, their cousins further south, so that the Fulani in the littoral states are really aware of this risk. They are terrified. And like what happened in the Sahel, they don't feel that the state is going to protect them. And that puts them in a real bind. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think both national governments, but also the international community can do to stop this from repeating itself in the littoral states, to learn from the missteps in the Sahel, and both first to stop doing harm, and then secondly, to build inclusion and resilience that could lead to peace. So on the harm side, for me, the number one headline is we have to stop police and military abuses of civilians, particularly Fulani civilians, but all civilians. The increased funding and weaponry that is being funneled by the international community to the governments of Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Cote d'Ivoire in order to stop extremism, unfortunately is, I won't say causing, but is closely tied to an uptick in violence against the Fulani, in extrajudicial arrests and killings. And that is going to have exactly the opposite effect of what we're looking for. The potential, I believe, for the military interventions in the coastal states to fuel conflict is much higher than the potential for those military interventions to prevent extremism. Number two, national governments must provide the benefits of citizenship to all citizens, regardless of ethnicity. They must stop the rhetoric about Fulani being outsiders. If someone is born in Ghana, this, for example, the Constitution says that they're a Ghanaian citizen. They have the right to an ID card. They have the right to services, and those services need to be provided urgently, the sense that they have a stake in the national government. I think very similarly, when we talk about the national identity, one of the things that we saw in the Sahel is sort of these national identity projects that were meant to sort of fuel pride. And I think that's a wonderful idea. But we have to really keep a close eye on those and make sure that fueling or supporting national identity is not supporting an exclusive view of ethnically who is Beninois, who is Ghanaian. And unfortunately, I think we are starting to see that, particularly in Benin. So we need to keep a really close eye on that. And then international actors. I think there is an urgent need for international actors to learn about the Fulani. I think there's an enormous lack of understanding, an enormous ignorance, and a lot of bias. And the result of that is that development projects, sometimes related to conflict and sometimes unrelated to conflict, have unintended harms. When we are supporting agriculture projects, we need to pay attention to whose land we are irrigating and whether or not we are unintentionally irrigating the transhumance corridors. When we talk about land tenure, we need to make sure that we are including land tenure for everyone who uses the land, and that we're not undermining traditional arrangements that shared land. So I think that that's a very urgent issue for the international community. I think that that's a sort of moral imperative. And then finally, in terms of not doing harm, the media. We see media inflaming conflict, sometimes through hate speech and disinformation, but more often at this point in the coastal countries through stereotyping and what I see to some extent as lazy journalism. You know, a suspected herder killed John Smith. The suspected herder doesn't get a name, right? And is he suspected to have killed, or is he suspected of being a herder? Whereas John Smith, he gets a name. And that sort of thing really feeds into this culture of blame and reprisal killings. So we've seen in Ghana in particular in the last year or two, reprisal killings against, and those are then presented in the media as from a hurt or conflict, even if sort of essentialist ethnic conflict, rather than, the very first killing might have been an opportunistic crime. It might have been a love triangle, for goodness sake, but it's being presented in these ethnic terms. In terms of what we can do on the positive side, I think building on what my colleagues have said, we need to build local capacity, both within the Fulani community, build Fulani CSOs like Tabital Fulaku and others that are doing great work, but have been largely ignored by the international community and local governments. And when we work with other CSOs, we need to be holding them to the standard of being inclusive. Just as we, when we design local projects, we ask about women's participation, right? I hope we're doing that consistently. We need to be thinking about ethnic participation. We need to be thinking about whether we are putting resources where everyone can access them, whether we are paying attention to the seasonal transhumance calendar when we plan events, and things like that, so that we can really empower the Fulani to be engaged in their local communities, and for that, for their contribution to be more visible. I think when we think about the differences between the Sahel and the littoral states, I think something that makes me feel more optimistic is the potential for local governance to play a profound role in, when this all started up in Timbuktu, or even north of Timbuktu, the first thing that we saw was that when the violence began, the representatives of national governments fled and created a vacuum. And I think that we're unlikely to see that in terms of the local governance in the northern littoral states. I think that the chiefs in Boku, and the chiefs in Karimama, they're unlikely to flee. And they have a closer tie to the community. I think it will be harder to push them out. And we need to really be engaging at that level to build inclusion and to build governance, even if the national government is not present. I think there are really strong initiatives by local CSOs, by SECOTAPs, by Save Ghana, by others, to start to build inclusion, and we need to be scaling those and giving those the attention they deserve. And then finally, I think that we need to be very thoughtful about development projects in other sectors, in security, economics, agriculture, about what we see as enough inclusion, and how we're integrating conflict sensitivity into those projects. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. I think you've really effectively picked up on a lot of the key themes from this discussion and from the presentation so far. And I want to note that we're now going to move into the question and answer session. So I'd really encourage you, if you have any questions, please do post them in the Q&A, or feel free to raise your hand. But I would like to go ahead and start with a question that kind of builds on that theme of inclusion and building local capacity that you raised, Laura. One of the things that we've heard several of the presenters speak about, in fact, I think all of the presenters in some shape or form spoke about the importance of the inclusion of local partners and local voices. And as we know, there are a lot of active local organizations, sometimes that are overlooked by the international community, that are working to build local resiliencies, that are working to counter the effects of violent extremism in their communities. What do you think are some of the tools or actionable solutions that we can provide these organizations, and their communities to further that really important work? How can we ensure that they're able to move forward? How can we provide them some concrete methods or actionable tools that they can use in their work? So let me start with turning that over to Laura.
Oh goodness, nothing like putting me on the spot. No, I think that's an essential question. I think it's not an easy question because unfortunately the sort of the mechanics, the bureaucracy of international funding makes it very, very challenging for local organizations to understand what's going on, to be engaged, and to receive funding. There's a huge disconnect between the requirements of accessing funding and the capacity of most organizations in the littoral states. I think, to me, a couple suggestions. One is to think, first of all, about engaging them at the policy phase, at the design phase. Often, I think we design programs and then we look for local partners to implement them. And that's upside down. We should be looking for local partners to tell us what would be useful before design. And that's challenging, it's time consuming, it's expensive, but it's the only way that we can have real impact. And it's the only way that we can earn the trust of the local organizations that we desperately need in this effort. I think secondly, we need to look for networks, and this is a word with a negative connotation, but middlemen. I think we need to look for organizations that can funnel that funding, that have there's some cost to doing business that way, but it might be more effective. And that if we're then able to channel the funding down to more micro levels, that may be the most expedient solution, at least as we're building capacity of smaller organizations. And then I think the last thing that I would say is we need to be more flexible about mechanisms. I know there are a number of people on the phone who have worked with USAID OTI. I think looking at small grants programs, I think that's a very powerful way to provide funding without such a high set of requirements for the local organizations. And I think that there are other creative ways to provide in-kind support, to provide access to the table. Sometimes simply inviting people to things is a very powerful way of giving them voice. It doesn't necessarily mean that every local CSO has to be ready to get $1 million in funding. Sometimes it means, bringing them to the table, paying for them to come to the Capitol for something, providing the equipment that they need, or simply amplifying their success, taking what they've done and using the media to magnify it. I think that can be very, very powerful without taking us through the sort of bureaucratic labyrinth.
Great, thank you very much, Laura. Pediton, I'd like to ask maybe if you have any thoughts or reflections on that same question.
Yes, I agree with what Laura had said, and I would like to add that the local community has its own organization to resolve crises. So the inclusion of this organization is key, and it is important to have their view, to invite them, and to have what they think. They think about everything is going on in the community. So I'm gonna give you an example of what people were saying on my field work. For example, in a part of Benin, people are, frequently saying that before the community policing was created, they have a group of hunters that ensure the security in the region. So because of this kind of reform, this group of hunters, they don't have the ability to do anything. So if the government can, work with this group and give them the resource, the necessary resource, they can help them, because there is a part of Benin that the police, community policies cannot access. There's no road. So these people, they know the environment, they know how this violent extremist organization, they work. So it's important that to include them and to work with them.
Great, thank you very much, Pediton. I see we have a question in our Q&A. So what did we get wrong in the Sahel that we still have an opportunity to get right in the coastal countries when it comes to peace building and C and PBE? And I'd like to ask Alan maybe to take a first crack at this, and then we'll go to you, Laura.
Yeah, thank you. I think a focus on governance, governance, and governance. I mean, that, as I said, is the breeding ground for violent extremism, is toxic governance, and I think we need to focus on recruiting and equipping community champions and champions at the national level as well. Local interventions are absolutely fantastic. Local communities want peace. They don't want conflict. They're just like everybody else. They'd like to be able to feed their families and have a peaceful life. But we need both top-down and bottom-up narratives going on, and interventions going on, and getting making sure that governments have a will to be involved in this and engaged in this. I think, as Laura has highlighted very well, driving inclusive narratives is very, very important. Making sure that those excluded or stigmatized or marginalized groups have a voice, are connected with authorities, do have a relationship with authorities. And I think, for me as well, is the development of research that really translates into action. And I have a background as well in OTI programming, and we talk about action research and OTI programming quite a bit. And it's making sure that our research is useful, it's widely disseminated, and that it gets in the hands of people who can actually program to what the research shows that the community needs and the community wants. So I'm really hopeful, because I think the littoral states have a little bit more resources than some of the other Sahelian states to combat this and to combat it in a healthy way. But I'm also very, very concerned about the over focus on military responses and security responses to these things, because I've just seen it drive people into more exclusion and more stigmatization, and we've heard those narratives from across the Sahel. So just really quickly, and I'll let Laura jump in and complete.
Sure, that's almost exactly where I was going as well, Alan. I think we have a failure to understand on a sort of gut level how extremism moves and how conflict moves. No matter how much we know about extremism, I think that there's a sort of default where we go back to almost like a World War I model of armies. And, if you want to stop the front, you just build a trench, right? You just build a deep enough trench. And I think that sort of logical mistake leads us to focus on border security. It leads us to think like, oh, if we don't want the crisis in Burkina Faso to bleed into Togo, we will just strengthen that border. And we have not seen that work. It hasn't worked. It hasn't worked in Mali or Niger. It hasn't worked in the Middle East. It hasn't worked in Asia. It hasn't worked with drugs and gangs in Latin America. These are not traditional armies. They are conflicts and conflict actors that move in much sneakier ways. Extremism and conflict move primarily because of the transfer of ideas and money. And we cannot stop ideas or money with borders. That's just fundamentally never going to work. And so I think that one of the big mistakes in the Sahel was focusing on border security, focusing on security in general, in the sense of security meaning weapons and soldiers. I think that we need to shift the understanding of security to talk about where people feel safe, who feels safe, and why they feel safe. And I think that's where bringing women into the conversations is particularly essential. When people feel safe, they can push back against narratives that they don't agree with. When they feel protected by the state, then they don't need arms from extremists. And so really looking at that sort of feeling of safety, inclusion, participation, rather than a militarized solution, I think is the number one thing that could change the outcome in the littoral, so that it doesn't look so much like the Sahel.
Thank you very much, Laura. I think these comments from Alan and from Laura raising one of the key weaknesses we've seen in some of the responses in the Sahel, in the international approach at least, which is underestimating some of these extremist groups, and that they're actually quite sophisticated and effective, and that when their focus is not so much on capturing territory, but more on influencing populations. So when there is this gap in governance, which I think Alan spoke a lot about, when you have governments that are not so interested in protecting citizens, then attacking, unfortunately, and repressing them, governments are better at delivering corruption than they are at needed services. It leaves that gap for extremist groups to be more effective, quite frankly, at community-based approaches than many governments in the region, which I think is one of the important lessons learned. I want to turn now to another question in the Q&A. A comment was made that development did not engage in the CVE space and was disconnected from realities on the ground. How would you change this reality? And I think this is something that Rita had commented on in his remarks, but maybe I can ask Petiton to take a first crack at this. How do we engage development and CVE? How do we ensure that it's grounded in local realities? What can we do to change that approach?
I think education is key, and people don't really understand what is going on. So a lot of awareness campaign as it was done. Let me take the example of Benin. So I think I said earlier that people are making a confusion between gender-based violence, because there was a lot of work which has been done to spread the word about gender violence. So if the same work could be, we can do the same work with violent extremism by education, implicating religious leaders, because the population, they trust more the leaders, the village chief. So these people need to be educated and to spread the word around them. So I think the key thing to do here is to raise awareness campaign and implicated the leader of the community so that they can spread the word around them. I don't know if I answered your question.
Thank you so much, Petiton. Really appreciate it. I just want to ask very briefly, because we're coming up on time, if Laura or Alan wanted to weigh in on this.
Yeah, I think Rita's comment was the fact that donors often came in and their focus was also on external issues and external actors and how to counteract those things. So that necessarily leads to a heavier security response. So I think that making sure that our programming is not focused on external forces, but on internal forces and internal community needs, really listening to community grievances, which are real and have existed long before these groups began to insert influence. And again, I think that's just one of the lessons learned, I think, is that we need to make sure that our programming is community driven and it really comes with deep consultation of local communities. As Laura said, that's difficult, it's expensive, it's not easy, but that's what has to drive programming, because communities know best what communities need. And there are resilience mechanisms in place, and even displacement. I was having a conversation with a colleague. Sometimes displacement is a resilience mechanism, and why did those people displace rather than take the easy path and support and be complicit with the VEOs coming in? Those are questions that I don't quite have answers to yet, but I'd like to have those answers. and why are some communities more resistant than others, and how can we reinforce those local peace building systems that already exist, and reinforce that capacity. So my quick brief.
Thank you very much, Alan. I appreciate it. I'd like to, I realize that we're slightly over time here, so I think we'll have to close it there. I really appreciate and want to thank our 4 panelists for raising some really critical points around inclusion and localization, contextualization, the building of democratic cultures, and really grounding our approaches in local communities and ensuring that they're community driven to apply some of these lessons that we've learned in the Sahel to peace building and improving resiliencies in coastal West Africa. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Nicole for some final remarks.
Thank you, Jen. Just very quickly to echo your sentiments, I also wanted to express thanks to everyone for attending this Dialogues with Dexis event titled Informing Peacebuilding in Coastal West Africa, Lessons Learned from the Sahel. And a special thank you to Rita, Pediton, Alan, and Laura for sharing their knowledge, insights, experience, and time today. Thank you also to you, Jen, and to center members Emily, Megan, Lori, and Tamara, and to Bridget and David. As a final reminder, please do check back the Dexis website for a summary of this event along with the recordings. And I hope you all have a pleasant, safe, and healthy rest of your week and year. And we all look forward to seeing you back in 2023 for the next Dialogues with Dexis event. Thank you. Take good care.